Saints, I am so glad that you have joined me today for the Abiding Reflection. I'd like to talk to you about a very famous story in the Bible. I think a lot of people know this story, both believers and unbelievers. It's the story of an underdog, story of how a young man by the name of David was able to kill a giant named Goliath. So I trust you're familiar with the story. Let me shed some light on that story, if you will. For the longest time, as a believer, I myself personally thought that we could be David, that you could be David and I could be David. And then many years ago, it dawned on me that I was not David. And listen, you are not David either. We are not David. What do I mean by that? Well, you remember on Tuesday night, I made reference to the language of the Old Testament. The language of the Old Testament is do or don't. So when we get stuck in that language, when we get stuck in that place, we begin to, by our own effort and by our own strength, try to slay the giants. And the giant can be any sort of sin, any sort of obstacle, any sort of thing that's in the way. So the giant represents anything that is something that you're trying to tackle or defeat. And listen, my dear brother, my dear sister, it is impossible for you and I to slay any giant. You remember that Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That is, Paul is admitting his own weakness. So the underlying theme of that verse is I am weak and I cannot slay any giants. I'm incapable. I don't have the power to. But then Paul says, but I can do it through Christ who strengthens me. My strength is not sufficient. My wisdom and resources are not enough. But Christ through me can slay the giants. Listen, David admits himself in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel in verse 47, this is what David says. He says, the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you, referring to the giant, give you into my hands. So saints, here's a beautiful thing that I want you to understand today. You are not David. You are incapable of slaying the giants that are in your life. Okay? That should be a tremendous relief and a tremendous sense of joy, a tremendous sense of freedom that you are incapable. It's such a wonderful thing to admit, I am weak, I am needy, I am poor, and I need a strength that is not my own. So, we've established that. You are not David, I am not David. So then the question is, who are we? Who are we? Well, I'm going to give you two options. There's two options left in the story. Number one, you could be one of the members in the army of the Lord that is very afraid, very fearful, hiding, confused, uncertain what to do. And that we could be that person. We can certainly be that person in the Lord's army. Israel, Saul, and all the army were afraid to fight the giant. We could be afraid, we could be fearful, we could be hiding, etc., etc. Or, I'm going to give you who we could be. We could be Jonathan. Listen at this. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, it says this, verse 1, now, when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him, that is David, as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Verse 3 says, then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Verse 4, and Jonathan took off the robe that was on him. He gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword, and his bow, and his belt. Listen, saints, I pray that you become a Jonathan. What do I mean? Jonathan, number one, surrendered his person. it says here that Jonathan loved David as his own soul. You see, the David in our story is Jesus. Jesus is he who is greater than David. David was a picture of Christ. In this story, he's a picture of Christ, if you will, a typology or a shadow. We surrender our person to our greater than David, Jesus Christ. We surrender our person to him. Jesus Christ is able to slay every single giant that comes into your life. And you, my dear saint, can rest in peace, can rest in joy, and know that your David, Jesus Christ, is going to go out and slay your giants. But you need to surrender. You need to follow Jonathan's example and surrender your soul. What else did Jonathan surrender? Well, we're told here he surrendered his robe. That talks about his position. So not only do you surrender your person to Jesus Christ, you surrender your position. Now listen, Jonathan is to be on the throne. Okay, he's the successor of his father Saul. But he says, I don't want to be on the throne. I want David to reign on the throne. I want him to be exalted. I want him to be edified. And saint, that's what we do. We not only surrender our person, but we also surrender our position. I don't want to be enthroned in my heart. I don't want to be in charge. Jesus, you be enthroned in my heart. You take over. May you be exalted. May you be edified. His person, his position, and finally, Jonathan surrenders his armor, even onto his sword. That speaks of power. So, saint, you surrender your person, you surrender your position, you surrender your power, your strength. You give up. What a beautiful picture here. You give up. You stop thinking that you're the David and that you're going to go out and make battle. David said the battle's the Lord's. You stop fighting your battles and Christ begins to fight your battles. So you surrender your power by admitting your weakness. You surrender your strength. You surrender your intellect. You surrender all of that to the person greater than David, Jesus Christ. So saints, I pray you're encouraged. You are not David. Stop trying to be David. Okay, and surrender to the greater than David, Jesus Christ. Then you're going to see giants falling in your life. Thank you so much for taking this time to watch today's reflection. I'd like to tell you this weekend we are going to have our service virtually Saturday at 4 o'clock. That information will be also in the email and we will send you a reminder as well. I hope you have a blessed day.